And when you eat a more nutrient-rich diet, those nutrients combat that inflammation. The consistency is the absolute most important key thing, no matter what the goal is. Many people will start with calculating their numbers and calories per ounce. I think calories per ounce is a waste of time for two reasons. Number one,
Kyle Kamp, how's it going?
it's good, Poldi. Good. How are you? Appreciate you having me on today.
Absolutely. I'm doing very well. As we just discussed before hitting the play button, we're both, I think, getting ready for the hunting season, excited to get into the hunting season. And, along with that comes some of the preseason prep, which, includes shooting practice, getting fit, but also I think what's important is dialing in somewhat of a nutrition plan. If you're going to be doing much backcountry stuff or, doing the type of hunting or other outdoor activities that require a lot of energy and nutritional needs. So some of the stuff I want to talk with you about today is that. But first, can you kind of just start by sharing how your interest in nutrition began? Maybe there was a specific catalyst that sparked your passion for the field, just so the listeners can kind of get a little bit of a background story on you if they don't know you already.
Yep. Nope. I think that's a really good question and a major part of my story. So I'm a registered dietitian by training for however many years I've been doing it, but kind of an unconventional path to get here. I didn't grow up eating healthy, didn't grow up knowing anything about nutrition, didn't grow up with an interest of like procurement of my own food, nothing like that at all. It's very much kind of an atypical route. I actually grew up pretty heavy and found myself at one point weighing 270 pounds when I was 20 years old. And I started having some health issues at that point. Obviously, I'm only 5'6". And so at 20, I was having a lot of high blood pressure issues, lab markers coming back. And I didn't really know what that meant. I just knew that it wasn't good, especially at such a young age. And I'd say like the catalyst, the big event, because even though I had those numbers, really didn't change. I didn't change anything. I didn't modify my lifestyle at all at that point. It became real to me when I started having like physical issues and laying in bed one Christmas morning, started having some chest pains and some different things that I knew were probably a direct result of my health. And so woke up, I was very much the New Year's resolution at that point. It was 15 some odd years ago. And slowly started making little changes in my diet that I knew that I needed to make, slowly started exercising, and really no idea about the specifics on either of those when I first started, but just kept being consistent and slowly started to see the weight come off. And when you start seeing some of that initial progress, it's almost like your own reward and you just want to keep going, right? And so that sort of birthed more consistency, and I kept wanting to see weight. I kept wanting to see more progress. And the way that I'm wired, like I'm very much like as a kid, I'm sure I was the kid that was always asking why, which is funny because we've got two boys and one of them is very much like that. And so I wasn't just satisfied seeing the progress. I really wanted to know why it was happening. And at that time, I went back to, was in college, changed my major, and started going to school for what eventually became my career because I wanted to know what was really happening. So, yeah, there was definitely an event that sort of serves as this very standout catalytic moment in my life where I wanted to know more about how nutrition worked, and it truly did changed everything about my life. The years that I lost that weight and learned about how nutrition works in the body.
Yeah, that's interesting story, and also I think a powerful one because I think most people who are interested in nutrition, it often comes out of like a wake up moment like that. Whether it is something more serious like having actual physical issues or just noticing that your pant sizes are going up For me, I'm a total nutrition nerd too, and for me it was that I was eating pretty clean, doing like a bodybuilding type, diet, but I would just absolutely crash midday to the point where I could not stay awake, and it was like becoming a real issue in my workday. And embarrassing in meetings and whatnot. I just immediately fall asleep. So um, that's when I really became like super interested in nutrition. It seems like that's how most people that really care about it a lot tend to get there. Is that something you see too with people, that it's usually like a wake up call is when they start caring about food?
Yeah, it's what's been interesting having been doing this as long as I have now is you can see not just like a single trend in time, but you get to see like the number of trends that have come over the years. And I would
Right.
definitely say that you kind of have two groups of people. You have people who, yes, something happens that scares them and generally drives them towards having to understand it now. But I would say one of the most interesting trends that's happened over the last even 5 years is like it's undeniable the effect that what we do on a day-to-day basis, with nutrition being a big part of that, how it affects our lives. And so you're starting to see more and more people who don't necessarily have a problem but want to find out more, right? And want to find ways that they can improve their health, I think. And they're great. I mean, whether you're kind of like forced into the situation like you and I were, or whether it's just one that you come to in your own volition and you think, man, I would love to learn more about this topic and see if there's anything in it that I could improve. I don't really care where you come from. I just think it's great that it's something that a person thinks that they can find more interested in. Right. And so, yeah, there's definitely been
Totally.
trends, and I do see that happen. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. I also feel, just with my friend group and in general, more people are interested in health and nutrition. Maybe it is because, like, I really think it partially is because of the podcast, like trend in the last 5 years, and more people talking about it. And, just the information that's getting out there, that's causing people to really be more interested with it or in it. But with that, since I've been following nutrition now and really been interested in it, I've also noticed that there is like a lot of trends and things happening in the nutrition world that change constantly. It's very tough. Like, I don't envy you as a nutritionist to keep up with a lot of stuff, and it's also, I'm sure, tough with clients, that are getting certain information online. So I always, when I talk to someone like you who's really studied nutrition and it's your day to day kind of life, I'm always curious to hear if there's something that you've maybe changed your mind on in the last few years in the world of nutrition, and why.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and a really good question. I think that it's easy to hear that question, and for someone who's in a position like me to go through and think about dietary things, right? Like, the low carb thing has really started to come about, and what sugar does or doesn't do for us, and the proteins and all the different diets. Like, it's easy to start silo your thinking around those things. And those are obvious. Those are trends, though, to me. I think what I've changed my mind around as a result of the science ever changing and the people that are interested in nutrition always changing is how there really is. And as a person who works with people, you really can't hold any line or thinking about nutrition too firm. My responsibility as someone who works with people with nutrition is to know the science of everything as much as I can, and to give that person a buffet of options. My job is not to hear what a person is curious about, to hear questions they've got, to hear what they want to do, and to tell them how wrong they are because there's no research that says that will work. Like, that's pointless to me. Like, that's
Mm.
ineffective. So I would say that something that I have had to learn and change my mind on over the last 10 years is like what my role is. My role when I first started, I felt like was, to be a nutrition superhero, dispel all the myths and correct all the wrongs and right all the wrong thinkings. And like, that's not my job at all. My job is to help people and, help answer questions they've got that may be help answer questions that are technical and sometimes difficult to understand in a simple way that they can understand. And and even with the science, like there is nothing absolute. There's always individuals, there's always individual cases, there's always unique scenarios, there's always things that one individual is going to tolerate, whereas 99 others aren't. And so you have to not hold any line too firm and learn how to work with people. Second thing I think that I've learned out of a result with that, and this is something that we say all the time. It's a phrase that comes up very often in our program. Is there's a massive difference between optimal and practical. I can tell you the most optimal thing on the face of the planet, but if you can't practically apply it, it's not really good advice. You
Right.
have to know how to translate optimal into practical for someone so they can actually go implement it and be successful. We have it's an interesting question because we have a podcast too that we release every other week, but the most recent episode was it's titled "I Was Wrong: 3 Things I've Changed My Mind About in the Last 5 Years on Nutrition." That did dive a little bit more into a couple of different topics, but even those are more broad as opposed to like, oh, well, over the last 5 years, I've changed my idea on how much protein a person actually needs. It's a little more specific, but still really broad because nutrition is such a broad topic,
Right. Yeah, no, I love that, especially because, the practicality of it all, I think, is super important. And then also, not thinking that you're there to really tell them exactly this is the only way, because like you said, there are individuals, and everything I've learned about nutrition, like the last few years, is like, hey, this is very like a bio individual thing. Like there are some things that work for people, but overall they kind of have to find their groove and see what works for them. And be that low carb or high carb or whatever. Just, there's going to be a goal, and then we'll figure out how to get there. And you also don't want to have someone who might be super pumped about starting something that comes in with an idea and then, kind of turn that down right away. Because maybe it does work for them, and if they're pumped about it, maybe that keeps them going. And that's kind of leads into my next question, because you work with so many clients, and I'm curious what you think about the consistency of nutrition. Like, how important is consistency, and is that maybe even the most, or one of the most important, like, factors to, for someone to really see success?
I would say it is the factor. I would say
Okay.
it is. I would say it is the difference between. And I'll give you another phrase. Like, we're full of phrases because I think that they're memorable and easy to remember. And in difficult moments, like that's what people need. They need something
Right.
quick they can go to, not some crazy intensive plan. I think that it's the difference between someone having success, whatever they define that as, in a nutrition program. It's not always weight. It's not always performance. There's a lot of different things that people would define success as. You might define it as being able to stay awake in mid-afternoon, whereas mine was losing 140 pounds. But the consistency is important. And this goes back to the practical versus optimal. And here's our one phrase. Our one phrase is, I would rather be occasionally good, or I'm sorry, I'd rather be consistently good than occasionally great. Meaning, I would rather be consistently at 80% than occasionally at 100, but the rest of the time, like, I'm all over the map. There is no consistency. The consistency is the absolute most important key thing. No matter what the goal is, there's got to be enough. You have to string together enough consistent change over time to see the end product, or to see whatever the outcome is that you want. you can't just do it a little bit and expect to see that happen. And that's true of so much, right? I mean, that's true of training. That's true of financial investing for retirement. That's true of gardening, planting, harvesting stuff. Like, you can't plant a seed and think, oh, we're good all winter. It's like, no, you got to plant multiple different seeds. You've got to take care of it. You've got to apply water to it. You've got to regularly, prune it. There's all of these steps, and you've got to be consistent to see that consistent progress. So yeah, it's a long-winded way of saying consistency to me, and my observation in doing this, is very much the make or break point for people.
Yeah. And I think so too. Like if someone asks me, oh, you've been doing, because I've been doing low carb for a long time and it works for me. And people are like, oh, what do you do? How do you do it? And I'm like, well, I do this low carb thing, but I think what's really worked for me well is that I've been doing it for years, and I'm staying consistent with it. And my friends that I think really see their goals through are the ones that kind of make it almost a lifestyle, and like that's how it's going to be from now on. And so yeah, it's good to hear that you're seeing the same thing with having so many clients that you work with.
Yeah well, and I think that goes back to point one, like, what have I changed my mind on? And to what you said, if someone comes into a program or an idea that they're really excited about, you're 100% right. If you shoot that down, they're not even going to apply it. And whereas if they're excited about it, they're very likely going to apply it and try to be consistent. But if you don't learn how to work with someone instead of coming in and trying to right all of the wrongs, they're not going to be consistent. And likewise, if you try to develop, or you see some program that your friend is following that's too restrictive for you, you're probably not going to be consistent. And a lot of people will feel like they didn't have the willpower to execute the plan. And at the end of the day, it's like, may have not been the willpower so much as your plan frankly sucked. You got to go back to the drawing board and create something that's going to, work for you. Now, with that said, every plan is going to have a challenge because it's not what you've been used to doing to that point.
Right.
There's going to be a little bit of an uphill battle at first, whether that's trying to go low carb for the first time, or whether that's trying to lose weight through calorie reduction, or whether that's trying to get enough protein for performance nutrition. It's going to be inconvenient, but like, if you're just like, I always envision it hunting. If you're trying to get to the top of a ridge so you can see more, it always sucks. But if it's a ridge line, by the time you're up there, the work is done. Like, for the most part, you're not really changing a lot by the time you get to a ridgeline. That ridgeline could run miles, and you're not having a lot of elevation change over the miles that you're traveling. And these journeys with nutrition, health, performance, etc., can be much of the same way. It's going to be uncomfortable at first, but if you keep going and you get to the top of the quote unquote proverbial ridge, it gets easier, but it's gonna be a little tough at first. But that's, I think, also what makes it easier, is that if you endure those tough moments, you learn, and then by the time you get to the quote unquote ridge, it's not as complicated. And that's where you have now put yourself in the position that a lot of people envy, which is, oh, I just want it to feel so natural. How did you get it to feel so natural, Poldi? Well, I've been doing it for 5 years, but on day 5, it didn't feel that natural to me.
Yeah.
But yeah, 5 years later, like, frankly, I don't even think about it because I've just been doing it so long, and a lot of people want to be there. And I think it's good for everyone to know, who is listening, who maybe wants to find that you will be there, but it will be a little tough at first. But if you endure the challenge, it gets easier by a whole lot.
Totally. Yeah, no, I love that. And I just, wanted to bring that whole kind of segment up because I think it shows to people that there is versatility out there. There are many different ways to get to your goal with nutrition, but
yeah,
just not giving up is, I think, the biggest point. And you get to the point, at least from my experience, where this is just how, like, you don't even want anything else. This is, you thrive this way. This is what you like. So thanks for laying that out for us. So,
it's a great question.
I also really wanted to chat about, or the main thing I really wanted to chat about with you today is kind of like backcountry nutrition needs. We have a lot of people listening that, are already living in areas where they can really get into the backcountry, or people that, aspire to go on, let's say, a backcountry hunt or a backcountry hiking trip, or, maybe walk the CDT trail or something like that. And I know you have, a good portion of your nutritional background or the work you've done in the past is helping people who have those kind of goals kind of achieve their nutrition plan and program. So I figured, a good place to kind of start would be to talk about the needs. I've heard you on, I've read into your stuff, and I've heard you in other podcasts and YouTube videos. And I know you've mentioned that the foundation of nutritional success is calories, and especially for the backcountry kind of trips. So can you kind of like lay out for us why starting with calories is important? Why is that a good idea?
Yeah, I think that calories are a major part of it. It's hard to give any more credit to that versus where your calories come from. I think that you could probably put those on the same level, but if you are right that you've heard me talk about calories being the main priority, and part of that is because the second piece of that is going to be determined by where those calories are come from. We'll dive into that part of it next, but a large part of determining where those calories come from is based on percentages of your total daily need, right? So you have to know the total before you can start to dissect, where do I want those calories to come from?
Right.
Because all of our calories are coming from three main places: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And for the most part, each of those, we call those the macronutrients for folks who maybe are not used to some of these terms. Each of those macronutrients really have one specific role in human physiology and in human performance. And the type of hunt that you're on is going to largely determine how much of a percent from each of those groups you give to your total calorie allotment. Now, that can be really confusing, so let me give you kind of an example here, okay?
Yeah.
Let's just say, for the simple sake of math, let's use 1,000 calories just because it's late in the afternoon and that is easy math for me. You would always want more calories than that, but let's just use that as an example that would be easy for people to grasp. And let's say that the intensity of your hunt is fairly moderate, not really too intense, but also certainly not like you're driving around in a car all day.
Right.
Right. So I started this by saying that each of those nutrients serve one primary function in human physiology and in human performance, which people don't think of themselves as this, but for some trips, you are every bit as active as an athlete. So yes, human performance applies to you in these scenarios. So the main job of carbohydrate is fuel for the brain and fuel for the muscle. The main job of protein is recovery or repair of that muscle. And the main job of fat is the transport of hormones and nutrients. Now, the body's very unique in that it can serve other purposes. So, for example, fat can also be a fuel source. Protein even could be a fuel source, although we don't necessarily want it to be. So we keep it simple by saying each of those nutrients serves one function. So now we go back to our scenario where you've got 1,000 calories for a fairly moderate hunt. If the hunt's fairly moderate and you're not having a lot of moments of high intensity output, you don't necessarily need a lot of carbs. So you may say 30% of those 1,000 calories are going towards carbohydrate, 40% may be going to protein, and the remainder of that may be going to fat, or you can manipulate the scenarios however you want. Let's say the intensity of that hunt was much, much higher, really intense. You're hunting the mountains of Alaska chasing sheep, and it's a very high, fast-paced hunt. You're going to want a higher percentage of your calories in that situation to come from carbohydrate, so the muscle doesn't get too depleted, and you've got a constant replacement of those. So the higher the intensity, the more of the percentage of calories you want to come from carbohydrate. Now, for a guy who eats low carb, that still might be lower than I eat. So it's not
Right.
to say that it's got to be asininely high carb, but it would be good to get a higher percentage than you get from your average workday where you're sitting in an office chair, right? And so to answer the original question, calories are important to know because when you know your total daily calorie needs, you can now go down and say, okay, here's the type of hunt that I'm planning on doing. Here's the percentage of calories that I need to dedicate towards carbohydrate. Here's the percentage of my calories that I need to dedicate towards protein for recovery. And here's the percentage of my calories that I need to dedicate towards fat to fill in the gaps or to provide as a slow burning fuel source, or whatever the situation might be in that situation. So the calories are important to know because it then allows you to really niche down to what I feel like is probably the most important, which is how do I want to space those calories out based on the meal, or I'm sorry, based on the macros that I need for whatever I'm trying to do from a hunting standpoint.
Yeah, totally. And there's plenty of calorie need calculators out there that people can use to kind of get a ballpark number. Now, knowing that though, those are usually like, they're not geared toward the backcountry multi-day hunting scenario or even hiking scenario. And I think it is important to note that you're probably going to need more in general for your machine to run. You're going to need more calories than you are expecting if you've never done it, right? Like, I remember a few years back, I was reading some study that I think it might have been Sitka, one of the brands was doing, and they were tracking the hunter's calories, and it was like, I might be wrong in a number, but it was like 8,000 calories a day for a guy. And it was a very high number, way higher than what I thought I would need first moving out here. So did you, like, just having worked with others in the past, do you have any idea for, like, maybe there's a percentage that people should add on, for going into the backcountry, kind of for needs, just to get a ballpark number?
Yeah, I hate the calculators too for that exact reason. And part of the reason, it's not a bias to say that I'm smarter than a calculator or anything by that. In fact, most of those calculators are based off of the Harris-Benedict equation, which is an equation that we've developed. So the gold standard for registering and monitoring how many calories a person needs in a day is called indirect calorimetry. And it's a fancy word for a machine that we hook folks up to. And it's a measure of gas exchange that tells you literally to the digit how many calories you need at baseline. So the Harris-Benedict equation, which is what most online calculators are developed off of, came out of that. So it's not bad information, but you're exactly right in saying, well, it's ballpark close if you're sitting in your office. And I've even found that to be a little ineffective, but it's a different conversation. But it's way off for somebody trying to head off into the backcountry. And so years ago, the military developed this equation called the Pandoff equation. And the Pandoff equation came from kind of the same premise, which is based off of height, it's based off of weight, it's based off of a lot of these different variables. But it's also based off of terrain type, meaning not just elevation, but there's a massive difference in output to keep the machine running, as you say. I love that phrasing. When you're hiking in sand compared to when you're hiking on asphalt, you're expending a lot of energy hiking on sand, or whenever you're hiking in, any of that really loose type of terrain compared to sure-footedness in asphalt. And so there's so many different variables involved, from that to pack weight to how well trained you are. You conserve a lot of energy when you're well trained because it's costing you less fuel. Your muscles are well trained, so it's not burning as much, right? So that's a value of training. So what we have done is you can use the Pandoff equation, but it's really confusing. And when you're hunting, it's not always linear. Like, you don't know if you're always going to be in sand or on rock or on dirt, or how long the trail is, or if the elevation will be 1,500 feet for a day or 2,500 feet or 4,000 feet. So we've develop something like we just recently built a calculator to estimate this, typically off of a person's weight, and then it gives them the ability to toggle between easy, medium, and hard output days, right? So they can
Sweet.
get an idea of is my, like, for example, a hunt could be that you're hiking in fairly far, difficult terrain on day one, but you're running a ridge for 2 days looking for animals. And those days are fairly easy. So you may not need as much on those days. So you can use that calculator or different estimates like that to really determine it. But to your point to the study, and we've done similar studies, even on mountaineers when it's cold, because your body's expending more energy there. It's difficult to know for sure. And I think that the best thing that a person can do is to take an estimate, give yourself a range, know what it is that you're planning to do, the terrain type, the terrain elevation, the distance, and give yourself a ballpark range to at least begin trialing this on. And going back to the comments that you made earlier, as far as experience and just having years of iterations where you've modified things that now fit you, I think this is true too. When it comes to nutrition and even our calculator, it is not to say that that calculator is gospel and that we are smarter than you. That calculator is designed to give you a baseline, a starting point. So you're not just winging it. But I strongly encourage you to get in there and make it yours, adjust it, manipulate it based on your experience. Maybe you take the exact recommendation that I said out of the box and you find it was too much. You couldn't eat it all. Right. Well, great. Now you've got a starting baseline to work back from. And so then maybe you shave off 500 calories and you go out and you realize, man, that wasn't quite enough. So now you're starting to find kind of that sweet spot. So my suggestion would be use a baseline, give yourself a baseline, trial and experiment with it, and then start to modify it and make it yours. But as a general rule of thumb, going back to originally what you had said, yes, in the backcountry is always going to be much higher than you're needing whenever you're sitting in a general office environment by a lot.
Right. Yeah. And that's awesome. I didn't know about that calculator. So maybe you can send me a link to that. I'll put it in the show notes for people to check out.
Yeah.
That'll be pretty sweet. I'll have to check that out myself. Because I've done, I know you can do, if you live in an environment where there's a lot of backcountry and mountains, you can, like you said, year over year, kind of get experience for it, and do a journal, track your calories, see how you felt after that day, with how many calories you ate. But otherwise, use it like a baseline, like you said, a starting point. Maybe try to emulate some of the stuff you'll be doing at the gym and just see how you feel. But with that, I think it's also important to say that, there might be one day where you are more of in a calorie deficit, and then the next day you eat a little more while you're actually out there. I think it's maybe important to just touch on, when does a calorie deficit become an actual health problem? Let's say if you're in a 7-day backcountry trip, or some people go 10 days, to really get the seal to deal with an elk. Are there maybe some symptoms, or is there any way to tell that, okay, I am definitely in a deficit here and this could become an issue that you're aware of?
It's a good and it's an interesting question. And I'm pulling this. I want to be able to give the folks who listen to this some actual guidelines in case they look at the calculator and don't necessarily want to download it. So we'll revisit how to come up with an estimate here in a little bit. So people have something that they can actually go off of, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, so specifically talking about backcountry needs, if you don't pack enough calories, and I think this is a unique, I think this is a take on it that people probably haven't thought of. So I'm going to bring this full circle in a minute. Worst case scenario, if you don't bring enough calories, is you're going to lose some weight. And you often hear people and read of people on forums really excited about and almost bragging of who lost the most weight during hunting season. Oh, I lost 15 pounds on a 7-day trip. That's not the goal. That means you didn't have enough fuel and you couldn't perform as well as you potentially could have.
Right.
And I think the difference between performing as well as you can and can't is a lot of times, folks will hunt for 2 or 3 days, really challenging days. Then they'll take the fourth morning off because they're so tired. The difference between having your nutrition dialed and not is you're not taking the fourth morning off. And if there's
Yes.
one thing that I've learned in the years that I've done this, it's the more time that you are out actively hunting, the greater the chance of filling the tag. Oftentimes opportunity presents itself just because you're out. And the more often you go, the greatest challenge of hunting is how much time it can pull you from home. Yet at the same time, like if success in harvesting your own meat is of high priority, the more often you're out, the higher your chances go up. The likelihood you're going out on a single day and harvesting it, filling a tag on 1 day hunt every year is pretty low. Right. So the difference between the difference between knowing your nutrition needs and not, and executing a plan, is the difference between taking days off and staying strong on days, all of the hunt time that you've got planned. And it's also the difference between glassing and seeing something that's up really high, down in the bottom of some valley somewhere, or off in a distance, and you feeling like, all right, let's go. And no, I just don't have it in me to go there. Like those are two key pieces in filling tags. And the difference between having energy to do those two things and not is a detailed plan. And this is the unique spin on it. If you know the demands of the hunt and you have the right type of fuel source, you're going to perform better having the right type of fuel source and not enough calories than you will in a situation where you have plenty of calories, but not enough of the right type of fuel source.
Interesting.
So to me, if I don't have enough calories, but have enough carbs, because I eat a moderate amount of carbs. Like I wouldn't say that I'm low carb. I wouldn't say I'm crazy high carb. If I have enough carbohydrate, but not enough calories, I will feel great the entire hunt. I could have tons of calories. Like let's say I pack tons of protein calories, but protein is is not a fuel source. It's a recovery source, right? So I can have all the protein in the place of the planet, but I may feel gassed climbing out of a hole, even if I've got 3,200 calories worth of protein, let's call it, right? So I think that you can't necessarily talk about having sufficient calories without also talking about having the right type of calories, because a little bit of weight loss from being low calorie may not have any consequence. Whereas having plenty of calories, but not having enough of the right type of fuel source, we often hear people having worse issues with that than just having not enough calories, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And then is there like, I'd assume, at least for me, I feel like in the past, if I was very in a low calorie deficit and I didn't know about it, I would feel, maybe a bit shaky, maybe like some cold flashes. Yeah. Are there any like symptoms that people should watch out for?
Yeah. That's a good question. And you asked that the first time, so I'm glad that you brought that back. Yeah. So if I would say there's a couple of things. If you're feeling a general fatigue and immotivated in the mornings, that's probably a good indication that you're not getting enough during the day before and in the days leading up to that. And then the tricky thing about nutrition is, like, if you've got a 7 or a 10 or a 14-day hunt planned and you find that you fall behind early, it's really difficult to ever make up for that without taking days or mornings off, right? So you really want to try to stay on top of it. Now, if it's a single day and you've been hiking a lot and you just haven't remembered or had the time to sit down, like if it's September elk and you've just been chasing a bull all day and before you know it, it's noon and you've been chasing him since 5, it's 7 a.m. and he's just got you going all over the place, then you will start feeling you'll start feeling, like you had mentioned, kind of dizzy, lethargic, unable to focus, the need to sit down. You'll have that feeling in your legs of like, I've got the motivation to do it, but there is just nothing in here to give. Like, I just don't have it in me. I'm not moving as fast as I normally would. And a lot of those reasons, I mean, a lot of those are what we would put under the heading of bonking, which is
Mhm.
a term that, a lot of folks might be familiar with. And at that point, you're going to need to fuel yourself with something if you want to continue to press on. And
Right.
so, two things that we focus with most often with people is totals and timing. And you'll often have people focus on one without the other, but they really work hand in hand, meaning you could have plenty of food, but you're not eating it with enough regularity, timing to make a difference. Likewise, you could be snacking all day, but it's not enough totals to really make a difference. You've got to master both of those. You got to be getting in enough with enough regularity to really be experiencing what it's like to never hit that wall and always operating on kind of that optimum full fuel tank so that you can continue to press strong on day 3, 5, 7, 10, etc. until you get out, unless you happen to look out and tag out early.
Right. Yeah. So it sounds like meal timing is also an important part of the equation there to avoid bonking. So, definitely getting enough calories, making sure you kind of have an idea for the macronutrients that you have, depending on what kind of hunt you're going on, and then also when you eat that food. And
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier, I really liked how you mentioned that there's different types of hunts where you might need more carbohydrates, or some where you might not need as many just because of intensity, like glassing or driving in a car to look for game versus chasing that elk in the morning. I think that's a really important point to make because I, at the beginning, I was doing keto and I thought when I first started here, oh yeah, I can totally do this all on keto. And, it worked, but like you said, I had those periods where, my body didn't want to go and I still had the motivation, but like something was missing. So for me, adding in more carbs really worked, especially during those high intensity times.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Yeah.
Well,
No,
and I know that,
yeah,
I know that for you, and particularly for the folks that listen to Year of Plenty, you're like, and it's great, predominantly whole food focus. So I think it's good too to have different types of carbs, right? So you want, in those situations when you hit a wall, you want to have something in your pack that's going to bring you back pretty quick. And so finding things like dried fruit or sticks of honey, those type of things that are going to bring that energy back to the brain fairly quick so you can recover, get something good in you and keep going. And I would say this too, like, people will often be apprehensive to stop long enough to eat, but the situation with that is if you don't create the time, you're going to be forced in it. You're going to find yourself in a point where you hit the wall and you're like, I've got to stop. And that's generally going to take longer to recover from than it would have if you were just intentional about, like, let's say that you've got a bag of in your hip belt pouch. Let's say that you've got some figs or raisins or trail mix or whatever, that you're just like constantly just taking little hand. It's not like you've got to sit down 6 times a day to a meal with a candlelit dinner and like Kenny G playing on the iPhone. Like you could just nibble on stuff periodically the whole time you're moving, constantly. Just like if you bugle and you're waiting for a response, you grab a handful of something, or you're glassing or your buddy's glassing, you grab a handful of something. You're just constantly trying to have stuff all day to where you never really allow your muscle to run out of that energy.
yeah, right. And for me specifically, I'm fine with having more breaks in between, but it obviously it goes back to just like how hard is the intensity, and I think that's the most important thing to really focus on when you're out there, and kind of the meal timing too, all that comes with that. So you spoke about the macronutrient needs. Um, how does that also overlap with meal timing a bit? Like, is there a certain time where you would need more carb, or where you suggest people eat more carbohydrates or they eat more protein in a meal, depending on what time of the day it is and all that?
Yeah, I think that the intensity of the endeavor is going to matter the most for sure. But I also think that if I were going to really put my attention to like the timing and the macros in any specific meal, it would be dinner, because that's your most opportune time for your body to recover. It's going to be the most rest that it's going to get probably throughout the entire duration of the hunt, whether that's, you know, an early season hunt where you're only getting maybe 6 hours of darkness, because in the West, like, it stays light forever, even in
Right.
September and especially into August. If it's a late season hunt, you're going to bed at 5 and getting up at 7, then it's a little more, you know, you got a little more opportunity to recover. But that evening meal, really focusing on a carbohydrate dose, whatever that is appropriate for you, and a protein dose, right? So the protein's going to start recovering the muscle. The carbohydrate's going to refuel that muscle with some good carbohydrate stores to prepare you for the next day. And a key piece of this that is unfamiliar to a lot of folks is, if you really want to maximize your opportunity for the protein to recover the muscle, you want to include some carbohydrate for a couple of reasons. Number one, when you have carbohydrate, it gives the body the opportunity to take that protein to repair the muscle. If there is no fuel source there, the body's going to take that protein and create energy out of it. It's not necessarily going to be strictly utilized for recovering that muscle. Number
True.
two,
Yep.
when you have some carbohydrate with that protein, it triggers the body to stop breaking down the muscle and to begin the rebuilding process. So you want that response to happen. And there's no better time for it to happen than in the evening. Now, it's not to say that you should neglect protein intake during the day or not really give any consideration to timing during the day. But at the same time, you don't, and on the opposite end of this, you don't want a lot of protein and fiber during really intense periods of the hunt. Protein and fiber are two nutrients that are challenging for the gut to break down. When you're moving, the body is shifting a lot of blood flow to the legs, and it's giving less of an emphasis to the gut. So digestion isn't at a premium whenever you're moving a lot. So if you're delivering nutrients that are tough for the gut to break down, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say the gut does digestion, uses up all that blood. It needs that blood to function. Yeah.
Exactly. So if the gut's not getting that and you're introducing nutrients that are difficult for the gut to break down, this is what stems from a lot of people complaining about digestion issues in, you know, backcountry hunts and with backcountry food. It's like, okay, well, show me your food list. And there's these really high fiber, high protein bars during really active parts of the hunts, and it's typically one of the reasons that, you know, you'll struggle there is because you're delivering nutrients that are difficult to break down in a time when the body doesn't have a lot of resources to break it down. And so you've almost got to shift away from that and find things that are easier to process, like we talked about earlier with honey or dried fruit, or, you know, your own trail mix or your own granola that you've made or whatever it is, so that you can get some easy to process fuel sources in your gut that allows you to keep going.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really important to touch on. And I agree that, you know, protein is and fat, even, they're very satiating to me. They often, like, you know, like you said, they sit in your gut for a bit. It's not the best if you're really hiking up mountains hard. If you're just doing a morning of glassing, I think it's okay. But if you're like really getting after it, you know, it's going to be a really hard day. Really continually fueling with those quicker carbohydrate food sources. I know, you know, I think you recommend gummy bears a lot too. And even though a lot of people do like to eat more whole foods, you know, that's something you can make yourself. We started making our own gummy bears this year. We haven't dialed in the perfect recipe yet, but like, you can forage for some berries, you know, add some honey. If that's something you want as a little reward, you know, why not? And I think it can be really powerful.
And they make molds for that. Like I have some good friends who really enjoys involving his kids in some of the preparation for stuff. And so they've bought molds. They have what's the technical term when you have a beehive, like a full bee colony?
Um, I'm not sure
I keep wanting to
exactly
say
what that.
apothecary, but I know that that's right. I know that that's not it. Anyway, they have a beehive, but they have like a full hive, and they harvest honey and they sell it. They have a production at their house. So he likes using the honey and developing flavors of his own gummy bear. So you're right. It doesn't have to be like, some big box brand, artificial, whatever. You can use, there's a lot of great whole foods, simple carbohydrate that you can fit here. And so, yeah, it sort of has become a comical thing where we recommend gummy bears, and they work great for folks who aren't necessarily worried about eating whole foods. But if that's a priority to you, there are still alternatives where you don't have to only eat those.
Right. So what about with meal timing? What about early in the morning? You kind of mentioned having some more carb heavy meal at the end of the day to refuel some glycogen stores and also some protein with that for recovery. During my day to day, I usually, I'm a fan of just like eggs and some sort of meat in the morning. Just helps me avoid that energy dip that I was alluding to earlier. That first got me interested in nutrition. And I think the same goes for hunting. And from my experience and my girlfriend too, I remember last year we had 2 hunting days together where she ate a big like oatmeal in the morning and felt like she was dragging on that morning, but then like having more eggs and the meat, a little bit of burger meat, just gave her, it felt a bit better for her. So what generally do you recommend for people that eat early in the morning to kind of start the day out? Is there a specific, does it really matter, or is there a guideline you can give?
Well, it matters only as much as the person, right? So
Yeah.
like for you guys, that's going to be number one. I've worked with people who did that and they're like, I don't feel good. And it just feels like because it's so much protein and fat, it just sits with me and weighs me down when I'm hiking. I've worked with people who say like, I'm not even hungry till 11. Is it okay if I wake up, get to the top of a ridge, glass for a while, and then sit down for coffee and breakfast at 11? I've worked with people who say, I feel like I need some fuel, but I can't move with anything in my gut. Do you have any suggestions there? And we come up with suggestions there. So that's the beautiful part of nutrition. And it goes back to like the first part of the podcast that we opened with. It's very much going to be tailored to the person. And it's not to say that you and your girlfriend were wrong when compared to the person who says, I need a lot of carbs in the morning. And it's not to say that the person who needed a lot of carbs was wrong compared to you guys who like a more high protein, high fat diet. It's really going to be dependent on the individual. It's going to be dependent upon, the nature of the hunt. And it's going to be independent upon, like what you've got available to you. Like for some people, eggs and meat and sausage, like they're 10 days packed into Alaska for a sheep hunt. That's not an option. It's water and whatever's on my back. So it's always going to vary. And I think that you're only going to know that, I think, through experimenting and experience. So it's hard to give any sort of a universal recommendation. I will say this. For the vast majority of people that we've worked with, they either like something, but not something heavy, in which case we'll typically try to recommend something they can drink that has some fuel in it to get them to wherever it is that they're going for that morning. And or they don't like anything, but they want to eat later. And the question most people have is, it's like, well, I've always heard that I should wake up and eat so I've got some fuel, but I don't really want anything until later. Is that okay? And the answer to that is yes. I mean, if you're not having any of those complications that we mentioned earlier, and you're not hungry until 10, and you're not dragging tail getting up to the top of the ridge in the morning, Is it okay? I don't see any reason it's not. Right. So I think that it's, the hard part about nutrition with some of this sometimes is like people want a factual answer. And
Right.
sometimes it's very much like, what do you want? What do you enjoy doing the most? For me, what I have sort of gone back to is I like I like waiting until I get up and do like my normal exercise and training for general health around 4:30 in the morning every morning on an empty stomach because I just feel better. And so that's just what I'm used to. So even when I'm hunting, I've grown to kind of doing that. And then as the sun's rising, being on the ridge and being able to sit down and make a cup of coffee and eat my breakfast, like you just can't beat that. There's
Yeah.
nothing on the face of the planet that beats that feeling. So I've kind of resolved to, to doing that. But yeah, I think I'm talking in circles here, but it's very much going to be dependent upon what each person wants.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, that's, part of just the, it is in a bit talking in circles, but it's just important to always bring it back, I think, to like the personal, how it differs from person to person. But there are some actionable steps you can take, like figuring out your calories, kind of seeing what macros you might need depending on the intensity of the hunt, and then also the meal timing, and then I'll obviously like bringing it back to what you like and what you're used to. Now, along with
Yeah.
that, we've only been talking about food, but I think part of that is also an important part of how you are going to be digesting food and how you're feeling out there is also hydration, right? And that's something I had to learn the hard way. My first elk hunt, I took a liter water bottle, and man, I was dying after a while. And where I really felt it was the days after. So,
Yeah.
do you have any suggestions on how much should people really be drinking? Because I think it's just like calories and calorie needs, I should say, the amount you need to drink in a multi-day backcountry scenario can also be, or is also very important to consider.
Yeah. It's very important. It's also very individual. And when what what makes this hard for people to follow, I think, is that all of the quote unquote technical suggestions are almost too technical. Meaning, again, you go back to practical and optimal, they're optimal recommendations, but they're not practical to execute on a hunt. For example, what you generally find is they'll take a person's body weight and they'll say, okay, well, based on that, you need a certain number of ounces every 15 minutes that you're active. Well, on a hunt, you're not active every 15 minutes for 12 hours. So, like, how do you calculate for that? Not to mention, how am I supposed to manage when 15 minutes has gone for the next 10 hours to make sure that I'm getting that? Not to mention, like, how am I supposed to measure 15 ounces out of a water bladder? So again, it's optimal, but it's not practical. So here's a couple of things that I think is a little easier to follow. As a general rule of thumb, I think it's safe to plan for 1 milliliter per calorie. So, and you can simplify that by saying 1 liter for every 1,000 calories. You have 3,500 calories, 3.5 liters. You have 2,000 calories, 2 liters. You have 2,500 calories, 2.5 liters. Now, from a practical, like logistics standpoint, I think you could simply say, okay, my water bladder is 3 liters. I'm going to be out most of the day. I'm going to try to drink that. Just going to try to get through that during the day. The other 0.7 liters, if your goal was 3.7, I'm going to have in the morning, maybe with coffee or tea in the morning. I'm going to have with dinner. Maybe I'm going to make some sort of a mix. I'm going to have some water in my dehydrated meal. That should cover my bases, right? I think that that's fairly safe. If you set that and you pay attention to what color your pee is, right? You can gauge whether or not it's enough. If your pee is really dark, God forbid brown, you're way behind. You're going to need to increase, and at that point, I would probably increase by half to 1 full liter, and then see if that does it. if you're peeing relatively clear to fairly pale yellow, you're probably in the sweet spot, of getting enough, right? And so I think that's a general good rule of thumb, and why, again, it's good to know calories, because you can use it in other areas. But I think and I have found that to be a lot more practical for people to follow than trying to manage fluid intake on a 15-minute basis and, trying to determine how many ounces that is, etc.
Totally. Yeah, I love that. Actually, that P example definitely brings it, like, that resonates with me for sure. And that does make it practical like that, because it is so tough. And then also, do you recommend, like, electrolytes or something for people to bring along?
Yeah. And I was going to say too, I mean, and this segues into electrolyte conversation. If you're in an early hunt, like, another good gauge is if you're working but no longer sweating, or if you're no longer peeing, you're way behind. I mean, that is a telling sign that you are not getting enough fluid in, and need to make up from whatever it is that you've got planned. Now, you could have all the water in the world in your bladder. If you're forgetting to drink it, now it's a logistics thing, right? You got to work on figuring out some sort of practical way that you can make sure that you're getting enough in. If it's an early season hunt, it's really hot, you're a really salty sweater, you're training or hunting, and you're always noticing that there's a salt rim on the bill of your hat, or on this, around the ring of your shirt, you would be what we consider a salty sweater. You're drinking a lot, whatever. You're eating mostly natural food, so there's not a lot of added salt even to your treats, or even to your snacks. You're going to want to bring some kind of an electrolyte supplement to replace those losses, right? Particularly on early season hunts. Now, what we kind of say as a cheat is we call it the rule of 3 for hydration and electrolytes. Typically, you're going to want to get 3 liters in a day, and you're going to want an electrolyte supplement that's got at least 300 milligrams of sodium in it. So simple, like, rule of 3. Now, we're assuming that the state of health is generally good. You got good kidney function. You don't have any issues with, cardiac issues. Generally, rule of thumb, though, for most folks, it's going to land you in a spot that you want to look at. Now, you're going to find electrolytes out there that's got 800 milligrams, 1,000 milligrams of sodium in it per container. Do you need that much? Is that enough? You could. I mean, maybe that's a taste preference thing. But to be effective for replacing sodium, you want to aim for at least 300 milligrams as a minimum. You'll find others that are lower in that. Does that mean they're bad? Doesn't mean they're bad. It just means that it might not be sufficient as a electrolyte replacement. Maybe you like the taste of it. Maybe it's got something else in it that you like. That's still fine. Doesn't mean it's a bad thing, but it's not necessarily going to replace the electrolyte that's most often lost in sweat, which is salt.
Right. I love that. Yeah, those numbers are good to know. I didn't know exactly what the numbers were. And as far as I understand it too, you want some sort of carbohydrate with electrolytes to really ensure good uptake, right?
Yep. So you're going to have, when you start, oh gosh, used to, like, there weren't many options. You had a couple and that was it. Now there's so many options out there. You're going to have some that have electrolytes but no carbs. You're going to have some that have carbs but no electrolytes. You're going to have some that's basically just flavored water and doesn't have carbs or electrolytes. But to your point, yes, you want carbs and sodium, because it is going to increase uptake. And every time you have carbs and sodium, water follows that, right? Water is always going to be absorbed more when there's carbohydrate and there's sodium present. So I am generally recommending that people have a supplement from an electrolyte standpoint with carbs and electrolytes, as opposed to just one or the other.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point to make, because, like you said, there's so many options now, and a lot of them I see without any carbohydrates in there. And at the beginning, again, being on mostly a low carb eater, I was like, oh, great, no carbohydrates. But then learning more about it, I'm like, well, I'm kind of wasting this if I'm not either eating some carbs with it or having it in there. So that's, I think,
and I think there's a difference. Like, I think that, like, in this day and age where low carb has become so popular and people are following it and some people are really loving it, people are then thinking, or at least what I've found in my experience in working with people, that the inclusion of any carbs is bad. And like in our conversation, I think that we both could agree that we're saying, like, when we're saying have some carbs, nobody's saying like go out there and get loaded on donuts. We're saying like include a little bit more than you might on your daily diet. It doesn't mean you got to go crazy and start adhering to some nutrition protocol that doesn't agree with your normal dietary uh, uh, guidelines that you're wanting to follow. It's just saying that if you normally don't eat any, bring some dried fruit, bring some granola that you've made at home, or, you know, you can do a DIY electrolyte mix or whatever. Bring some more on you than you usually eat, even if that's not putting you categorically as high carb. Like I think that's an important piece to highlight, because otherwise you get folks that are, you know, they hear that they're like, well, I'm not going high carb. We're not saying that. We're saying include more than maybe you usually would.
Right. And then kind of go, go off feeling from there on, or from that point on, I would say, see how you feel afterwards. Yeah,
Yeah.
because if I ate a whole bunch of donuts, man, I'd be the same as, if I ate a bunch of stuff that's super hard to digest, I'd just be sitting there and probably have a sugar crash and, not motivated to go after elk. Unlikely.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So, to kind of bring it all together, we talked about just some general recommendations and mentioned that it's all very based in the individual, but do you have any tips on like how people can plan their meals? I know people talk about calories per ounce. I don't know how you feel about that. Kind of just figuring out what to bring, how much to bring each day. Is there like any guidance you have there?
Yep. So I am also unconventional in this. Many people will start with calculating their numbers and calories per ounce. I think calories per ounce is a waste of time for two reasons. Number one, it's a waste of time because the food that you bring, even if it's a high calorie per ounce, is only as good as you're going to get to eat it. If you bring a bunch of stuff that's really high calorie per ounce and you hate it by day 5, who cares what it weighs?
That's
I
so
don't care if
true.
it's the lightest thing on the planet. If I can't eat it, it doesn't do me any good at all. So I always start planning my own and others by saying, what do you like? What do you like to eat? Sky's the limit. You think of anything. Don't think if it packs well. Don't think how much it weighs. We'll narrow that part of it down. Just think about what you like. Day 5, you've been gnawing on salami and cheese all week. Maybe you want something. What all do you like? I start there because of that very reason. Then the next thing that I'll do is I'll start to try to plan out, how do I want to space that, right, over the course of the day. And I think that starts by knowing your hunt, knowing, okay, am I going to have the support of a cooler and a vehicle and a stove? Or am I basically going to be condensed down to boiling water and rehydrating everything because I'm going to be 10 days on a big hunt or whatever? Knowing what type of support you have and knowing your hunt, so you can then plan out your calories and you can then plan out your macronutrient needs from your carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. When I know what it is that I want to take because I like to eat it, I just adjust the portion size of that, to fit my calorie and macro needs. Where the weight falls, I'm not as concerned about until it starts to become like a 10-day backpack hunt or a 14-day backpack hunt. At that point, I'm having to go back and try to figure out, all right, where can I give and take within this? Because if you're going 10 days in and you've got 3 pounds of food, that's 30 pounds of food, right? And if you can winnow that down to 20 or 25, you do have to pay attention, but it still goes back to, well, what do I like? So in that situation, what do I like that might be a little higher fat, right? A little less carb or a little less water even, right? Because sometimes some of the weight of food is simply water. And, so then at that point, I'm trying to winnow it down. And this certainly isn't to keep plugging our template, but that's exactly what our template does. So page 1 gives you your nutrition needs based on your weight, based on easy, moderate, or a difficult day. But then it also gives you 5 blank template days to help lay that out. It gives you some samples. It gives you some examples. It gives you a grocery list. It auto-populates a grocery list as you start to build your plan, so you can print it out, go to the grocery and buy stuff with some convenience. But again, I think to simplify it, it's backwards from like what you'll typically hear on podcasts when people talk about nutrition. I always start by asking, what do I want? What do I like taking on hunts? What do I'm 10 days in, 8 days in, 5 days in, I'm not seeing anything. Like, what do sometimes pulling something out that I love and forgot about is a morale booster on day 5, and sometimes having an extra package of coffee midday is something you wouldn't normally think about if you're planning calories per ounce, but it's something I'll remember if I start my thinking with, what do I want? What's nice? It's going to be a cold hunt. Maybe I want to take some warm soup that I've dehydrated instead of my typical cold lunch or whatever, it is that I typically bring. And then from there, you can begin to build the plan and, really outline it and make it what you want from your needs standpoint.
Yeah, I love that because that is very true. The worst thing I think you can do is pack stuff that you don't like. And then you're like, it goes back to the motivation part and actually sealing the deal, right? You're there you're going to suffer for sure, but you're also trying to limit that as much as you can. And food helps because we all like to eat and like to eat good things.
Yeah.
Yeah. do you know how much people like on average even eat a day in terms of like poundage wise? That might be good to just kind of know,
like how many,
like I the average man eats 2 pounds a day in food or something. I don't know if there's a number that people throw around
in the backcountry.
In general, just to kind of get an idea for how much you might need.
It's gonna vary based on. So, for example, I think that this is a good question. If you eat a more nutrient dense whole food diet, you are eating more pounds of food per day than someone who eats a lot of processed food because it's full of more water.
Right.
It's full of more water and nutrition, right? And so like when people are losing weight, they often think, "Oh, I need to eat less food." And so they'll be eating on smaller plates. The answer to weight loss is not less food, it's less calories. You want, giant plates of food of fewer calories if your goal is weight loss. It's not less poundage of food. Now, when you talk about like backcountry targets, which is I think kind of what most people will probably be interested in here, I think if you're getting anywhere between 2 and 3 pounds per day, and you're getting somewhere between 25 and 3,500 calories through doing that, you're probably in that sweet spot of, not carrying too much food and also not being so miserable that you've just got a bunch of stuff you don't like, even though it's really light. Now, I'll give you an example. I've got we've done a 10-day hunt, totally backpack supported, where you got to be a little more weight conscious. And the weight on that was about 2.2 to 2.5 per day with about 3,500 calories.
That is a good example. And I think knowing that will kind of help, just give people a ballpark for how much they can expect to be eating daily. I just never even thought about it that much. Like, how much food am I actually eating a day in pounds, So, Kyle, I know you got to go soon, so we'll keep it maybe to one more question. I think a good one maybe to touch on, if there's a way to really answer it, is, how should nutritional strategies kind of evolve as hunters and outdoor enthusiasts kind of age? Let's say someone from the 20s to their 30s to their 40s, I assume they have some different nutritional needs.
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say foundationally, they don't change a lot in the sense of we all need varying amounts of all three nutrients, right? And a lot of that is just going to be based off of our daily lives. From a training standpoint, to what type of job we do, to what type of adventures we go on in the backcountry. Now, decade by decade, your calorie needs drop, but not as significantly as most people would think. Generally, by 100 to 150 calories per decade. So your drops aren't substantial, but they do reduce some. What increases is your need for some nutrients. Part of that is because as we get older, we don't absorb things as better. And it's obvious to say that as I get older and I hit my 40s and my 50s and my 60s and my 70s, I'm going to look older. My skin elasticity is not going to be as good. It's going to be obvious sides of aging on my face. What we don't think of, though, is that similarly, our organs are getting older too. They don't function as well. So we don't absorb as much. And therefore, we need greater quantities or amounts of some nutrients to make up for that, to meet enough of our actual daily needs. So you might need a multivitamin, or you might need to eat, different nutrients. The other piece that changes as we age is, I think, the need for more nutrient dense foods becomes important, not only because of what I just mentioned, but because we don't recover as well as we do when we're younger. Inflammation's higher in the body, and when you eat a more nutrient rich diet, those nutrients combat that inflammation. And that could mean a lot of different things. I mean, exercise, as good as it is, produces inflammation. And so those nutrients combat the inflammation from exercise and help you recover better. So inflammation is not always this, bad thing. Sometimes it's good. And inflammation is what allows us to grow a muscle and perform better, right? But eating a more nutrient dense diet does help as you get older. So although things don't change a lot, I think it's important to stay aware of what your intake is and to make sure that you're meeting those baselines so that you can, continue to do things that you love as you get older.
Right. No, I think that's huge. And I think you're totally right about the nutrient dense food. And I would just encourage everyone to make it a priority now already, even if you're younger. Like, I'm in my 20s, like, focus on nutrient dense foods. It's going to just help you thrive more. That's my opinion, but I think there's good science to back that up too.
Yeah.
And just, a lot of anecdotal evidence from my friends who I've seen make the switch from, not thinking about their food at all, eating whatever they want, and then really focusing on whole foods and just trying to eat as many real foods as they can and nutrient dense foods. So, Kyle, man, thanks so much for coming on. I think we covered most of what I wanted to really touch on with you, and thank you for making things practical. I think that's huge, or at least trying to, because I know it's tough with nutrition, giving guidance, like we discussed. Like, these general guidelines, in my opinion, don't work too well. They can work, but at the end of the day, it's best to really work with someone like you, honestly, and really see what works for that individual person.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Poldi, I appreciate you having me on. We've talked about doing this for a long time and happened to kind of bump into each other in Bozeman, and you've always been gracious, and I love what you do and the support that you offer to hunters in the community. And it's a pleasure, honor being on. And I know there were a few things we didn't cover, so if we ever want to go back for part 2, we definitely can.
Let's do it. I'd love that. And is there anything that you think we didn't cover now that, that maybe I missed, something you really want to give to the audience? Maybe we covered it all, but
No.
maybe
I think you are, for the folks who listen to this and maybe don't know you personally, like you could just be a podcast host to them. You are an underrated podcast host because you ask very good questions, and you come up with an outline and you hold it loosely, which I think you have to do as a podcast. But the questions you sent over were excellent and very insightful, very thought provoking. And so like I think you're probably, in my opinion, underrated as a podcast host and as a guest to podcasts. That's something that you always appreciate whenever you get on one and someone's put some thought into it ahead of time. And I think that's what makes for a great episode. So if anyone feels like this was a good episode, hopefully they do. That is much because of the work that you did ahead of time. So thank you for being a good host and having me.
Well, I really, really appreciate that. That really means a lot. And, I care about, just like you with your stuff, care about bringing value to the audience. So got to do homework and got to put effort in. Also, I want you to share where people can find your stuff, because you have a podcast, you alluded to it. You work with Mountain Tough, you have your own nutrition a coaching company. So how can people work with you if they wanted to dive deeper into this and maybe even find the right plan for them?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you bringing that up. It's kind of you. So our business is called Valley to Peak Nutrition, and if you punch that into Google, you'll find our website and really just about everything that we have to offer. We do have the Valley to Peak Nutrition podcast, which is on all of the main podcast platforms. And there's a ton of topics under there that you can go back and listen to. You can search it on our website if there's a particular topic that you want to find. But there's tons of free resources on the website. There's some really, really, really low cost, what we hope is high value things as far as helping you detail your own nutrition plans on there as well. And we have all the social media accounts too. But yeah, if you search just Valley to Peak Nutrition, you should find anything that you might be interested in.
Right. And for anyone listening right now, I will definitely link it in the episode description so they can find it easy. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll have a link there too. And yeah, definitely check Kyle out and keep learning about nutrition. And I think it's important to make it part of your everyday life, not just if you're going on a backcountry trip, because it is such an important thing and it is going to make you feel better if you dial it in.
Yeah,
I can promise that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I appreciate it. This is an awesome conversation so far, and hopefully we can do round 2.
Yeah, I would love to. Appreciate you having me on.